We're gonna hit record, so there we go. Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is John Erickson. I have the distinct pleasure and honor of serving as the board president for the ACLU of the Southern California. It is a great pleasure to be here with you all. Just so you all know, we are recording this webinar so we can make sure individuals who couldn't make it tonight can also watch and see all the amazingness that we're going to hear tonight and experiencing like they were here themselves live in the Zoom. So one thing that I love so much about the ACLU is this dedicated group of activists. We have Dick and Sharon, Michelle, Malik, everyone on the Economic Justice Committee. Thank you so much for putting this event together, this webinar on such a crucial topic, and one topic that we all care very deeply about and one that we all need to take action on. It's my honor to be here with you all, and I'm not going to take up any more space because you didn't come for me. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle White, and just a little bit about Michelle, because she's amazing, spoiler alert. Michelle was an attorney with the U.S. Civil Rights Division, the National Committee Against Discrimination in Housing, Fair Lending Assistant to the United States Comptroller of the Currency, housing attorney, and is a housing attorney with the Western Center on Law and Poverty. And currently, Michelle is the executive director of Affordable Housing Services, on the board of Fair Housing Council of the San Fernando Valley, and on the board of the Pasadena Foothills chapter of the ACLU, and is a member of the affiliate's Economic Justice Committee. Welcome, Michelle, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I think we should do a little intro on the various co-sponsors, and they include LA Progressive, and you see Dick and Sharon, Dick Price and Sharon Kyle, who are the editors and publishers. They're also the chairs of the Economic Justice Committee, and we have them put to work tonight. They're going to be fielding the questions, vetting the questions, and giving those to the various speakers. We also have Malik, who is representing the Occidental Critical Theory and Social Justice Department, and we have the chapter under the affiliate in the Pasadena Foothills. So these are the co-sponsors, and we put together this forum as one of a series. We will have occasional other forums on economic justice issues, and we will send you information as to when those are coming about. Questions should go into the Q&A, and Dick and Sharon will be vetting those. Unfortunately, we do not have enough time for all of the questions that may come in. So we will have to limit them to 3 questions per speaker until such time as we figure out whether we have time for additional questions. We're going to start out with Francisco Dueñas, and he is with the, he's the executive director of Housing Now. He organizes and engages in progressive working class and gender identity politics and policies. And he is just a really dynamic person who pulls together all kinds of coalitions and guides us through a lot of the progressive and not so progressive agendas on the state level, especially. So Francisco is going to talk about where we are with regard to COVID, and the impact on already insecure tenants in California, and especially Southern California. Francisco?
Thank you, Michelle. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the invitation from the ACLU and the other co-sponsors for today's webinar. As Michelle said, my name is Francisco Dueñas. I am the executive director for Housing Now. We are a statewide housing justice advocacy coalition focused on policy at the state level with a really led by organizations that organize tenants of color, mostly organizations that are, I would say, at the front lines being impacted by not just our housing crisis, but also our displacement crisis. In, you know, as Michelle alluded to, many Californians were already facing instability with their housing even before COVID. And obviously, COVID has exacerbated that. And I'll share a little bit about some of the a report that some of our coalition partners did. But for those of you that have been tracking this, it's been a year and a half, of trying to help keep families housed during this pandemic. And we haven't been successful with everybody. There have been, some Californians who during this pandemic have lost their housing because our protections haven't been as strong as they could be, because there is a power imbalance between landlords and tenants, and because so many people were already precariously situated with respect to their housing. So, at this present moment, we are facing another potential eviction cliff, which I will talk about later, and some of our other panelists will also address. But just briefly, come June 30th, many of the protections that we currently have in place for those renters who have been impacted by COVID and have not been able to pay their rent are expiring. And we, as of now, do not yet have any indications from the legislature that they are going to be extended, that there will be or a plan B. We just don't yet know what our leaders in California are thinking about this. Let me share a little bit more with folks about the context that we find ourselves in. I'm going to share some slides. Can folks see this? I know there's a delay.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So currently in California, this is from the National Equity Atlas. They have created a web page, a dashboard of information called Rent Debt in America. And this is a project by Policy Link, which is a national organization focused on equity issues and really looking at the research and the policy behind them, and Right to the City network. So if you go on that website, you can click on, and there's a drop-down menu, and highlight specific jurisdictions. In California, they estimate that there are 730,000 households that are currently behind on their rent. Okay, that's almost 1 million households. Obviously, these are households, so there's usually more than one person in each of these households. So that's definitely more than 1 million people impacted. Estimates are that the actual amount of rent debt currently standing at 3 billion in California. And Policy Link has been tracking this. 4 months ago, it was above 4 billion. It has waned and waxed. This is the most recent estimate. And the per household that rent debt is 4,400. So that's how much of these 730,000 households, around the average that each one of them is owing in rent debt. Obviously that differs, per household. 8 out of 10 of those renter households that are behind on their rent lost employment during the pandemic. So you can see from my final bullet point there, 57 of them are still currently unemployed. but you should know that we are talking about mostly people of color, 78%, and mostly people that were already low income before the pandemic. So again, speaking to the precarious nature of these renters prior to COVID. We recently did a report or a study where we asked many of the organizations that are helping tenants connect to the rental assistance that the cities and state has available, to ask them what they are seeing amongst their community, amongst the folks that they are helping. And we took away a few different findings. So this is one area of those findings, which is basically that housing instability and that lack of rent relief does cause negative health impacts in folks, right? So we had high reporting of mental health concerns, greater overcrowded housing that then led to COVID exposure. Many tenants have been forced to cut back on other types of essentials, whether it's medicines, whether it's food, in order to pay rent. And then on the plus side, when we do know when that rent relief is available, it has positive effects. And so similarly, the state's eviction protections that we have had during most of the pandemic has prevented hundreds of thousands of COVID cases and over 6,000 deaths. And so that was from a UCLA study that was done, really making the connection between keeping people housed in their homes to be able to stay housed, and shelter in place, and the displacement that happens when people are forced to move through eviction or other means. So here are some of the other ways that we heard back from this report that tenants are continuing to face housing instability during this period in time. So 84% of them, of the respondents to our survey, said that their community members or clients had faced an eviction threat. Again, these are people that were impacted by COVID, and so should be covered by the state's protections. 76% reported that they had clients who had been harassed by their landlord. 69% reported that they had clients who had moved in order to not continue to increase their debt. One dynamic, though, is that most of those folks, after they've moved, are no longer eligible for the state's rental assistance as currently configured. And so they still owe that back rent without that safety net that we have created. And then 59 of them reported having had clients who became homeless during the pandemic. So we do have some, as I mentioned, we do have some rental assistance at the state level or some places, city or county, but the relief is getting out very slowly. And so these are some of the barriers that our report were able to document. So 92% of our respondents talked about technological challenges or barriers to their members filling out the application for the rental assistance. 87% reported difficulties with communicating with their landlords. Perhaps they didn't know, their landlord didn't get back to them, in a timely fashion, or perhaps they don't know how to communicate with their landlords. Perhaps there's a property management company in between, and there's not easy communication there. 83% of our respondents talked about having members, clients, community members who are worried about their immigration status being a challenge in terms of accessing this rental assistance. Um, Currently, the state's rental assistance does not ask for immigration status, so folks should know that. 83% had clients who feared landlord harassment or retaliation, or who had challenges. 75% had challenges documenting the loss of their income. Perhaps they had jobs that were, where they're street vendors, or they were not traditionally paid, and so had challenges doing that. Here is just to round us out and get us, you know, get some of our other panelists in here. We currently in California have 4.6 billion in federal funding that was dedicated for California renters. But as of last week, only 20 million had been paid out. And a year into our pandemic, we are facing another eviction cliff come June the 30th, as I mentioned, as our current eviction protections will expire on June the 30th. Okay. I feel like I left folks on a sad and somber note, but I will say that the protections that are in place were advocated by communities and organizations like the ACLU, like many of the sponsoring groups that are on this call. So that is why our coalition and some of our other panelists today, we will remind folks about the advocacy that we need to do. So this is just a little bit of a context to let you know why we need to raise our voices and make sure people, our legislators, hear from us. So turning it back to you, Michelle.
Okay, thank you. Dick and Sharon, do you have questions from the audience?
Yes, so thank you, Francisco. So the first question says, it feels like no one is looking out for tenants. What can we do if the legislators don't take action before June the 30th? Now, Francisco, I know you mentioned obstacles to being able to act, like technical obstacles, problem with the website. Well, what happens if people can't get support before June the 30th?
Yeah, that's a really good question. If folks remember the 2008 foreclosure crisis, we had so many families that were in the process of both applying for a home modification, even while their foreclosure was also moving forward, right? And the two things never aligned, where they were able to get the relief they needed before the foreclosure happened. And so that's what we're trying to prevent this time. So there is two types of advocacy, I would say, that are needed. So one, we are asking our legislators to extend the current protections, right? As you all heard, this rent relief is only now starting to get out into the communities. We have heard from the administration that they are going to make the application easier to fill out. And so we are hoping that that speeds things up. But with less than a month to go, we don't know, and the program has been running since March the 15th, right? So we feel like we're not going to get that full 4 billion out in 1 month when we've only done 20 billion in, a month or 2 months, close to 2 months, right? So folks should call their legislators, especially call the California Senate leader, Senator Atkins, Speaker leader, Assembly Member Rendon, and really they're the main ones are as our California leaders in the legislature, moving this forward, or can tell us whether this is going to happen or not. The second type of advocacy, I would say, if you know a renter who hasn't gotten their money, they should call their legislator and let them know, hey, this is hard for me. I'm not able to access this program. And those legislatures should also feel like they have to be on the hook to support their community. So,
Thank you, Francisco. Your answer kind of answered two other questions that came in that I'm going to make live. Then a question in a different vein that came in is, what can be done to, if anything, to protect small landlords from losing their properties due to unpaid rents?
yeah, that's a very good question. There folks should know that there are foreclosure protections for homeowners and landlords that were instituted by the federal government, pretty, soon after the pandemic started. Unfortunately, fortunately, that covers around 75% of homeowners and landlords if you have a federally backed mortgage, right? And so our coalition was supporting for a statewide bill last year to cover the remaining 25% of homeowners and landlords who didn't have a federally backed mortgage. And so this affects landlords too, because obviously the rent relief that tenants need is going to the landlords to make sure, again, as well, they don't lose their home. So, in this case, again, I would say both of those things, folks should definitely call their legislators, the legislator leadership, and let them know if they are a landlord facing foreclosure, facing are at risk of losing their properties. And they should also call their legislator and let them know, hey, either my tenant and I can't get through and get this money, or I'm having difficulty working with this rent relief program. But the money is there, and that is so frustrating, right? That tenants and landlords in this case should be getting the support they need. And so
Great.
we're going to keep on working on that.
Thank you, Francisco. So we had a couple of questions that were asking, how do we get access to the billions of funds that have been released to the people? And you've kind of addressed that. But in 2008, there was a big bailout to the banks. And you never really heard about the banks having technical difficulties getting to the money, jumping through hoops. It was somehow just made available to them. We need to address the ways that obstacles are put in front of people. It's like, they're not really serving the people. How much of that 4.8 billion will actually get to the people? And what can people do to dismantle all of these obstructions? And why, in your opinion, don't we hear more about this in local news? And I just put together 3 different questions. So
Yes.
you can answer those.
Yeah, those are all really good questions. Let me just briefly mention the website for the state's program. Folks should look up Housing is Key. Google that, Housing is Key California, and that should take them to the rental assistance program for the state. There's a phone number there as well that they can call. When the federal government gave out these funds, some cities and counties got their own allocation directly. So there might be a program locally that makes more sense for tenants. So, but if they call or start at the state, I'm hoping that they will get pointed to the right place. So that's one answer to your question. I think your broader questions about obstacles for those most in need is definitely true. That is why we did this survey, because the state had made it difficult for some cities and counties that wanted to do their own program. One of the dynamics currently with the state's program is that it requires the landlord to participate in order for the tenant to receive sort of the maximum amount of reimbursement. And so that's definitely a challenge, and it's going to be a barrier to making sure that money gets to where it needs to go. And then the final thing I will say, and locally, for example, in the Los Angeles area, we have a coalition called the Healthy LA Coalition that has been actually advocating for sort of getting around the bureaucracy and just asking the city and the county of LA to seize the debt from tenants in order so that they won't feel any of the negative effects from that debt. And then landlords can just apply directly to the city or county or the state for those funds. But it's sort of like extending that safety net for everybody so that nobody loses their home during this time, right? Because right now we're depending upon this bureaucracy to work, and obviously it's not, and people are falling through the cracks. So I think we need something better. We definitely need not just an extension of what we have, but we need an improvement of what we have.
So we have a last question before we'll move
Oh,
on.
actually, we had 3 questions. Let's stop at this point and let Gary take over some of the not legislative, but litigative and other kinds of remedies that might be available to people. And if we have more time, we'll come back to more questions.
Okay, go ahead, Michelle.
Sorry. Go, Gary. Oh, Gary is a litigator out of Santa Monica. He used to be in private practice and do a lot of fair housing work. He now mixes his fair housing advocacy with consumer representation, and he does a lot of work on behalf of tenants. He is the deputy city attorney in the city of Santa Monica, so he can talk about what's happening now from another perspective, the local city perspective, as well as talking about some of the monies that have been used on the county level to create representation for tenants who are at risk of eviction. Gary?
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks to the ACLU for hosting this important program tonight. I'm going to get my PowerPoint up and running here. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right, great. Go back a slide or two. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, as Michelle alluded to, I'm going to talk about 4 ways that local governments can help reduce evictions in their communities, and these are legal remedies. Someone else from the city would need to speak to how we use funding to help with rental assistance. But out of my office, the Public Rights Division of the City Attorney's Office, we have been focused on creating legal remedies for tenants and their attorneys, and how to best make sure that tenants and owners understand their rights and obligations under those. So the 4 things that we are doing and that other local governments that we work with are doing involve eviction moratoriums, tenant harassment laws, fair housing laws, and those are 3 things that we help enforce and help with public education efforts on. This 4th one, support right to counsel programs, is designed to help assure that every household, every tenant that's in an eviction case has an attorney who will be representing them from start to finish in their eviction case. All right, starting with the eviction moratoriums, just a couple of points at the local level. The cities and counties are very often much more nimble with their responses to the pandemic issues that have come up. We saw this in the very beginning when cities and counties were able to pass pretty comprehensive eviction moratoriums much faster than the state did. And I think one of the questions for Francisco was that something to the effect that what can we do as we're waiting for the state to either extend SB 91 relief or come up with something beyond that June 30th deadline that we're all facing. And that, I would say, is something that cities and counties can help with. Several cities and counties have eviction moratorium on non-payment cases waiting in the wings, that they've been preempted by SB 91. But once, if SB 91, God forbid, is not extended in some way, shape, or form, then, for example, the city of LA's eviction moratorium that were in place before are revived because their moratorium lasts for the duration of the emergency. The other thing I'll say, in my opinion, is that cities and counties have to dedicate staff time and other resources to enforcing the eviction moratorium. To help bolster what nonprofits are doing, we just need to have, some hotlines and some online resources, and also people to call and talk to about their issues. In Santa Monica, we have a staff of 7 in our public rights division, 5 attorneys, including 5 attorneys, and all of us have at least a part-time responsibility with respect to eviction moratorium enforcement and education. And I've provided an example from our online efforts that's where you can see excellent summaries of SB 91 and how it works with our local laws. The next thing I'll want to discuss is tenant harassment. You see right there some examples of tenant harassment laws statewide and then at the local level. Generally, these laws prohibit bad faith conduct by owners. And I'm sure there are some owners online here tonight watching this. And I just want to say, we're talking about a really kind of small, nasty minority of landlords and owners that are that we run into with tenant harassment cases and fair housing cases all the time. If you're watching this, you're not one of those, because you're trying to find out more about the laws and everyone's rights and obligations. But these laws prohibit landlords traditionally from doing things like deliberately neglecting the repair issues in a home, using tactics that are intimidating or coercive and try to get the tenants to leave perhaps a rent controlled unit, or perhaps accept conditions that they shouldn't have to, and also limiting entries by landlords into tenants' homes. The new pandemic era application involves bogus eviction notices and bogus eviction lawsuits. We want to make sure that in this swirl of moratoriums and new laws and stress that tenants are facing, that there isn't that we want to limit at least the bad faith notices and eviction filings that landlords might file just to try to get the landlord or just to try to get the tenant to leave without checking out their rights. Our tenant harassment ordinance in Santa Monica creates liability for the landlord if they persist with a bad faith eviction and the tenant prevails. And prevailing could be just the fact that the tenant gets an attorney, the attorney files requests for discovery or files a motion, and the landlord withdraws the case. That's a win for the tenant. And at that point, either the city or the tenant can file a new lawsuit against the landlord. That type of relief helps deter landlords from starting the bad faith actions from the get-go. And as far as kind of actions, folks can take, you might want to see if your local city or your county has that in place, or someone that can help you enforce that. Another area are fair housing laws. And just to make sure we're all on the same page as to what fair housing means, fair housing laws are those laws that prohibit housing discrimination. In the rental context, they prohibit a landlord from treating an applicant or a tenant differently because of their membership in a protected class. I've listed the classes for California here, and you'll note that I've underlined 4 of them. These 4 are the classes that we have seen either an increase of cases during the pandemic, or excuse me, or a new twist, new types of discrimination that we had not seen before. We're short on time tonight, so I'm only going to talk about one, and that's source of income. But I'll be glad to come back sometime in the future and talk about the other classes. So with source of income discrimination, that's when a tenant has a verifiable, lawful source of income, and the landlord treats them differently, adversely, of course, because of that source. So there's an applicant, they either have Social Security as their income, or TANF, or veterans benefits, and the landlord says, no, I don't accept tenants with that kind of income. The new kind that the state law recently changed, I say recently, it was a couple of years ago, they added to the definition of source of income rental assistance. And as you're going to see, that has become a big topic in the pandemic and economic shutdown era. I went ahead and gave you 2 sites for these, for 2 source of income ordinances or laws there. Okay, so here are the general examples or situations. An applicant has Section 8 or some other long-term assistance, and the landlord says, no, I'm not going to accept that. We don't take applications from Section 8 voucher holders. And by the way, if you don't, just Section 8 is a program where the federal government, often through housing authorities, pays for the vast majority of the rent, the tenant's rent being limited to 30 to 40% of their income for each month. So that helps tenants who are rent burdened stay or find housing. And as you see with number 2, with in-place tenants, it can help them keep their current housing. And so even though a landlord may have rented to a tenant for 10 years, the discrimination, illegal discrimination does kick in if they say to that long-term tenant, no, I'm not going to accept your Section 8. And the excuses of the past, such as I don't want to deal with the federal government, I don't want to deal with the red tape, I don't want to take, I don't want to have a check deposited each month in my bank by the housing authority. Those no longer help landlords. Those responses are now unlawful. They have to accept Section 8 voucher holders. The third type of situation, short-term rental assistance, we at the city, and I'm sure most nonprofits, have seen a big increase in tenants who lost their jobs or lost income during the economic shutdown, and they turned to nonprofits for short-term grants to pay the rent or to pay the back rent. And in situations that we're concerned about with discrimination, or when the landlords say, no, I'm not going to accept that from a third party. And that now is unlawful under California's fair housing law and its relatively new definition of source of income. So I'll just note that owners can still ask about the source of income, of course, as they're trying to select tenants, but they can't discriminate based on the source. Now, here are other types of discriminatory practices with respect to rental assistance. Because of time is short tonight, I'm not going to go into this, but I provided in the slide in case you want to, screenshot it or get the slide presentation later. The one we're talking about tonight, of course, is one of them is the short-term rental assistance that people have been relying on. In Santa Monica, because we have the attorneys that enforce that both the local ordinance and then the state law, which is almost exactly the same as our local ordinance, we are able to contact those landlords and we turn their no's into yeses on a monthly basis. We've done dozens of those cases. We've only had to file, I think, one lawsuit against the landlord, and I think this has been a huge help in terms of just getting owners to accept short-term rental assistance during the pandemic, much needed assistance. Some possible issues right now. There's a program called, in short, the 80-20 program, and that's where the state will pay 80% of the back rent if the landlord will agree to waive or forgive the 20%. And it's really a pretty good deal for everybody, especially as we have so many owners who are getting by with no money. So here they only have to forgive 20%. The problem with our source of income protections is that generally fair housing laws can't require owners to give up money or often to even pay money. And so in many of these cases, the owner is going to be able to say no, and it's not, the source of income discrimination is not going to apply. What our office is going to watch for, and what everybody should watch for, are the situations where landlords have several of these decisions to make, and for whatever motivations, they say yes to some on the 80-20 and no to others. And we're going to be asking why no? Is it based on the tenant's race or their disability, or maybe it's the fact that they're in a rent-controlled unit and they have a very low rent, and the landlord's been waiting for a long time for an excuse to force the tenant out. Of course, the landlord is still going to have to deal with the fact that the state moratorium is converting a lot of this to consumer debt, so they may not be able to evict the tenant anyway, but we're sure going to be looking at those decisions that they make. And our office does that. And if stayhousedla.org, which I provide their citation or their domain name there, they work on those issues as well. Okay, finally, the fourth thing that Santa Monica has been involved with, and other local programs as well, is a right to counsel program. And I'll just say that everything I've said, the first three, ways local government can get involved on a legal level are pretty much overshadowed by just the need to make sure that every tenant in one of these COVID-related evictions has an attorney, not just self-help, not just help filing the answer. If they get an attorney from start to finish, the deck that's stacked against them in LA eviction courts is reversed. And the Stout report commissioned right here in Los Angeles in 2019 proved that. You see those amazing numbers. 97% of tenants in LA County evictions are unrepresented, and only 12% of landlords are. And then look at that flip that happens. Unrepresented tenants get displaced 99% of the time, while represented tenants avoid displacement 95% of the time. That's an amazing flip for there, and that's what we're going for with right to counsel programs, especially as we're looking at the pandemic and post-pandemic wave of evictions. In Santa Monica, we started a pilot program for right to counsel. But I'm very proud of the county of LA and also the city of LA. They took that stat report to heart, and they put millions of dollars into a right to counsel program for county tenant, anyone in the county. And you can go to stayhousedla.org. One of Legal Aid Foundation Los Angeles is one of the key nonprofits that are operating that program, and they can get a lot of tenants and households hooked up with an attorney. So those are the 4 ways that I know about directly, thanks to my work in Santa Monica, that local governments can help. And if you get involved with your local government, that's often you have a more direct approach than you do trying to reach out to your state representatives. But I think you should do that too. Don't stop doing that either in these critical times.
Thank you, Gary. I'm going to exercise the facilitator's role here and put off the questions until the very end. I want to make sure that Shanti has her presentation and that we also talk about action items and things that we can do to help with the crisis. So let's take those 2 components first and then come back to Dick and Sharon for questions that may not have been covered in the presentations. Shanti Singh is with Tenants Together. She is out of San Francisco and is a land use and tenant activist. I think she's one of the commissioners at this point, dealing with issues in San Francisco, and she is very active in Sacramento on the whole issue of what's happening now with the pandemic, but even before that, dealing with tenant issues and looking for ways to make tenants more secure. And I personally appreciate that as a tenant. Thank you. Shanti, would you take it away?
Yeah, thank you so much for that extremely flattering introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm blushing. Hi, everyone. Shanti Singh. I use she, her pronouns. I am technically my title. I guess I'll throw it out there. I am the Communications and Legislative Director at Tenants Together. Also, again, active here in very foggy San Francisco today. But yeah, I also have a couple of quick slides, but I'm just going to talk very briefly about what our coalition, Tenants Together is part of the same Keep Families Housed coalition that Housing Now is, that Francisco talked about. And we're going to have calls to action at the end of this webinar. But I'm just going to go through some of the legislative advocacy that we've been doing and what our demands are going into this month before before SB 91 protections expire, and of course going beyond June 30th as we look to what our demands need to be for a real recovery. So I'm going to share my screen super fast. Let me know if you don't see it. Turn this on.
You've got it.
Awesome. Great. So like I said, we are part with Housing Now and a number of other groups. These are just the steering committee members. Obviously, there's a lot of other organizations involved with the Keep Families Housed coalition. So really, there's 3 sort of sets of demands that I'm gonna go through that we're fighting for, and I'll try to provide some updates on our progress there. So the first piece out of 3 is protecting tenants from debt and negative credit impacts. This is something this is a conversation we're going to be continuing to have legislatively on the ground, et cetera, beyond June 30th. But I mean, it's really critical that, we ensure that tenants can access 100% of back and prospective rent, regardless of landlord participation. So now we're talking about demands here, particularly now that Governor Newsom, Gary went through the 80-20 sort of program that is in place, and that is what's in place right now, right? That we should assume that that's, if you're a tenant, you should assume, or a landlord, you should assume that that's the case. But we also know that as part of his, budget budget process that Governor Newsom has made the proclamation, at least, that he is prepared to alleviate 100% of everyone's back rent, right? And though this is a political promise that he's made, we're all still very much waiting for what the specifics and the mechanics of that are going to look like, especially with all the issues that we've already experienced with the rent relief program, which I don't need to probably repeat. I think everybody here knows that. But in terms of what we're really framing this as no renter should be left behind. No one should be coming out of this pandemic through no fault of their own with crushing debts or negative credit impacts, right? And that means when we're talking about some of these demands, we're talking about policies that we want in perpetuity, right? That dealing with the debt that anyone has accumulated over the COVID period or the state of emergency. So, and that also includes protecting tenants' credit, which is something that we're starting to see some credit protections now, but that's probably going to be a longer fight beyond the end of this month. We definitely want to prohibit the use of any kind of COVID-19 related debt as a negative factor of potential future discrimination against prospective tenants when they're looking for new housing. We want to make permanent any prohibition. We want to make permanent the temporary prohibition on the sale or the assignment of rental debt. This has particularly been an issue. We want to convert it to consumer debt, but we also do not want to commoditize renters' debt. I mean, that's a recipe for disaster. We don't want to turn it into some kind of obscure derivative or investment product, or have these landlords, some landlords farming this obligation out to God knows what third party who's going to, be very difficult to regulate or enforce how they're going to exact that debt collection on the tenant. And we want to, given all the issues that we're experiencing with the rent relief program, given the fact that we are seeing all the time on our, Tenants Together has a Know Your Rights arm. We have a free counseling hotline that we're completely overloaded with cases. We want to make sure that we're prioritizing access to rental assistance for tenants who are being threatened with evictions now, because they are. Even when those evictions technically are not above board, should not be going through. And of course, we're seeing ones that are going through, that is particularly in the Los Angeles area, that are fraudulent nuisances, really, really bogus causes to try to get around just cause provisions. We want to make sure that people who are already, have the sword sort of dangling over their head are prioritized in this program, because right now there really isn't a lot of prioritization going on with the application process, which has been really opaque. I'll get into that in a minute. The second piece, obviously the really big one, is extending and expanding SB 91 protections. And, one of the issues that we've really been dealing with the governor, with the legislature, is that, renters obviously already underrepresented in the legislature, ignored in the legislature despite being half the state. There's a lot of attitudes, structural attitudes in Sacramento. Of course, there's a dominant real estate industry, but there are a lot of structural attitudes, where we're now seeing that people kind of, now that there's a vaccine, there was a lack of seriousness about the issue the whole time, but now that there's a vaccine, there's an attitude now that it's well, it's over, it's almost over. The crisis is, we can restart. Let's just pretend that it's over for renters, especially. And that's frankly the attitude that we're fighting very hard right now. And you are seeing, op-eds and rebuttals and pieces from, real estate lobbyists in the Capitol who don't want this to be extended past June 30th. So we're fighting them. And of course there is, the governor and the governor's considerations. And unfortunately, in the sausage making process that is the state budget, it really can be a black box where grassroots groups are shut out of any kind of, actually making deals at the table. But, knowing that that's just an adverse environment, we are fighting very hard to make sure that we get a significant extension and that we don't play this game that a lot of folks want to play where they're talking about what's the date. Pick a date. There's got to be a date, because that's what they've kind of been doing. They've kicked the can down the road where they've said okay, there's it ends January 31st of 2021, the protections. Then at the very last minute, they extend that to June. They keep kind of kicking that can down the road, picking arbitrary dates, but there is no magic date where we all get recover as our communities, our society, the most marginalized of us are who have not recovered or gotten their jobs back for the most part. There is no magic date that you can set where it's like, this is the start evictions date. And we don't really want to be playing that game because it's a losing game. So we want to extend eviction protections until and tie those things to unemployment indicators. So, you know, especially among low-wage workers who are the most disproportionately impacted, disproportionately people of color, disproportionately facing eviction, homelessness, disproportionately can't pay their rent, you know, until we see these kind of actual indicators of economic and social recovery, we should not be just picking random dates to end protections. Obviously, that's going to be a really long shot, but you know, we are definitely pushing that idea as much as we can in Sacramento with legislators and with the governor's office. We also believe, of course, that you know, until the state has actually spent the money that it's supposed to spend on rent relief, that we really should not, under any circumstances, be allowing for any kind of eviction to even make it to court based off of non-payment. We also want to make the 15-day pay or quit notice. So this was before the pandemic, not 15 days long, right? But now, you know, at least theoretically, tenants have had 15 days to respond with a hardship declaration when they receive a pay or quit notice for non-payment from their landlord. We want to make that 15-day pay or quit notice permanent because it's just common sense. Having like a incredibly short 3-day period is just really not enough for struggling people to respond. We also want to, of course, make sure the tenants have time through this pay or quit period to access necessary legal aid and actually make sure that they're getting into the rent relief program. We also are fighting to expand just cause protections, which have been basically expanded in case of in a sort of a pandemic emergency situation, but really prior protections that are still in place and will still be in place, such as AB 1482, which is the rent cap. You know, those protections don't apply to the full scope of rental housing, right? There are a lot of carve outs, and we want to actually try to take this as an opportunity to push for just cause across the state. And lastly, on this part, we want to prohibit landlords from evicting tenants over COVID-19 rental debt ever, really. Anyone who's eligible for rent relief, if their landlord, especially if their landlord acted in bad faith, right? And you heard folks saying like, this is 80-20, that's a pretty good deal. People should take the deal. There is plenty of money on the table. The issue right now, of course, is that we haven't gotten that money out, or most of the money, the overwhelming majority. But we do want to make sure that, you know, whatever debt that a tenant has accrued during the COVID rental period, if a landlord is acting in bad faith, they simply should not be able to evict a tenant over that debt, right? If you were eligible for rent relief and you did everything you could, which desperate tenants are, then like it's just not excusable to, you know, evict for non-payment. And there are other policies that are a little more nitty gritty. I won't totally get into those, but, you know, even sort of reinforcing that system by maybe allowing, like having the state provide some kind of verification mechanism whereby they give the tenant even just a letter that they could use in court saying like, you know, this tenant applied for rent relief, like this tenant did everything they could, you know, so that they can have their eviction, their wrongful evictions thrown out. And then the third piece of this is the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, or ERAP. Like I said, we've all been talking about the major issues that we're experiencing with that. And some of these are things that we're starting to see put into practice, which is a good sign. But you know, again, like I don't want to like I don't want to get ahead of myself in terms of when these improvements are going to be rolled out, because we are dealing with these state agencies hopefully very soon. Apparently it's underway in progress, but we definitely want to simplify the application process, especially for tenants whose landlords refuse to participate. We are hearing that BCSH, which is one of the state agencies that's in charge of this program, are trying to basically get the application time down from, I believe it's about 3 hours right now, to 45 minutes. We want to provide access to detailed program data to the public and to advocates, data on usage, who's applying, you know, how much information we can possibly have on that, whether it's like, you know, like race, income, et cetera, like aggregated, not personal, but aggregated data on like who's actually accessing this program, or is it small landlords, is it corporate landlords, whatever information that we can get. And this is particularly an issue because that data was supposed to be public by now. It was supposed to be public a couple of months ago. And so far, there were supposed to be dashboards. We were promised all of this by legislators that we've spoken to in private, and we haven't really received any of it. So there's really not, any kind of transparency or insight into who's using the program, what are the backlogs, what are the issues that they're experiencing, why is this so slow to get out the door? None of that data, and also like critical demographics about the people who are actually accessing and applying to this funding, so that we can go ahead and look and identify communities who have not had access, who really need it. Language accessibility issues. I mean, this is particularly, this is true everywhere in California. It's been acutely one of the primary issues in San Francisco, where I am, that, a lot of these resources are simply critical application resources are not available in a host of languages. There's been some issues with Spanish, although Spanish has been the most okay in terms of all of the necessary information being consistently provided. But when you start talking about, tenants who are monolingual speaking, or reading in Chinese, Hmong, Tagalog, Punjabi, what have you, I mean, the resources really start to drop off, and language justice has been an enormous, enormous problem for a lot of these communities when it comes to actually accessing the information that they need and applying to the program. Like some of the application software isn't even available in some of these languages, and that's really, really a problem. And then two more things, again, this is related to the language accessibility. It's outreach and prioritization for tenants in underserved communities. It's also related to the data, obviously. How are we going to know, who we need to target, who we really need to make aware of their rights and aware of this program, and who do we need to assist, who do we need to deploy on the ground in terms of partner community organizations who can reach these folks if we don't have information about, which tenants are able to access this relief and which ones aren't. And then again, the positive thing about this, I don't want to be totally negative. A lot of this is being worked on. It is being improved. And that is because of the advocacy that all of you all, that the coalition, that all of our members, that tenants, that we've all been doing, applying relentless public pressure to the government, through the press, through legislative advocacy, through lobby visits, through angrily emailing your legislator, which you should do at every available opportunity. All of that pressure has resulted in actually creating a consensus that the current rent relief program, for reasons that a lot of us advocates predicted before it opened up, is not working. And so that, a lot of that public pressure, I think, has finally gotten to the governor and made it a liability in the way that it needs to be to actually get the improvements to the program that we've been asking for. So I do count that as a victory of advocacy here. I don't want to be completely a downer right now. And another one thing that I think is a very positive development, although of course, again, we're not going to know what is in the final budget really until about June 15th. And then we suspect that any extensions of SB 91, that's going to go in a trailer thing. So really we're working with the next 4 weeks here where we got to go really hard. And between the 15th and the 30th is probably when we're going to start to see what's coming out with the protections in themselves. But one positive thing that we have seen is that, we were all part of making an access to justice request, right? The courts are already overloaded. They're going to be even more overloaded. I guess I don't need to tell this to the ACLU Southern California, but, we were part of a broader access to justice request to take a few $100 million of this legal aid, of this federal relief funding, and direct that to getting tenants lawyers. So this is being spearheaded primarily by Assemblymember Jesse Gabriel. You may recall he tried to pass a state right to counsel bill last year, 2 years ago. And, he did not succeed, unfortunately didn't leave committee because I guess that idea is too controversial for Sacramento. I don't know why. But this is actually, instead of putting the requirement first, this is basically trying to go at another angle, which is putting funding out first. And that's going to be super critical. And we do, and he does have a bill, which did clear the assembly with 50 votes and is now going to the Senate. It's called AB 1487. It's going to establish basically a homelessness prevention fund, but you can think about that as essentially a right to counsel fund. And right now we're tentatively hopeful that we asked for $200 million. Hopefully we can get all of that. Luckily, the budget chair in the Senate, and Senator Skinner, is actually pretty gung-ho about the proposal. And I believe she's a co-sponsor on 1487. So hopefully that's another coalition win we can hopefully all be happy about. But, it's not over until June 30th. So that's pretty much everything that we've been pushing for, that we're going to continue to push for. And again, it's really a 2 to 4 week sprint right now. So we really, and Francisco, I think, shared the resources that we're asking everybody in terms of calls to action, petitions you can sign. But if you have the time, call your legislator, call their field office, let them know that, things are really, your community is suffering, things are really happening, you really need urgent action. You can't just sit back and act like this crisis is over just because everyone's vaccinated. We really need all hands on deck, and we need to make sure that the legislature and the governor especially does not, sit back and take a passive sort of role on this right now, or come to the conclusion that, just because the pandemic is hopefully, knock on wood, winding down, that everything's better for California tenants, because that's the attitude that we are really, really fighting tooth and nail in Sacramento right now.
Thank you, Shanti. Francisco, I know that you had a slide that related specifically to the kinds of things you'd like to see our membership become engaged in. So can you put that up now and we can discuss? Maybe you and Shanti can discuss where we're going and how quickly we can get there.
So, but while Francisco is getting that slide, I just wanted to remind the attendees that we're not answering questions from the floor. So someone has their hand up. If you would just type your question in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon.
Hey, Michelle, I know that I'm going to pull up we have a petition, online petition, and then we also have, sort of different social media graphics that folks can use to promote that they have called their legislator, or to get other people to call their legislators. Let me pull that up. I sent it over to you and the other organizers, and I know that you will be sending it out in an email as well. So just wanted to flag that for folks, that there's nothing that we are sharing now that you won't be getting separately in an email.
Okay.
With some of these same links.
And just to clarify, that email will go out tomorrow with video links that you can share.
Thank you, Malik. I also wanted to point out to people who are more active on the local scale that this is the time when a lot of cities are doing their budgetary planning and adopting budgets. So if there's a way to get resources like Gary has in Santa Monica as part of your city budget, that would be great. And in addition to that, if there are people who are interested in working with the tenant unions, they could use the assistance, especially with not having all the legal resources that are really necessary to help some of the people who are coming to the table. And we have these every other week meetings in Pasadena. I know that they're going on like that in LA and other places. So just wanted to point that out. Okay, coming back to Dick and Sharon at this point, to have you raise some questions that maybe you could identify who would be best to answer those questions?
Okay, so earlier we mentioned relief for small landlords, but we have a question that comes in. What can be done to ensure that the mega landlords who are responsible for much of the rent insecurity from gaming the system and sweeping up funds meant for smaller landlords? I don't know who's best for answering that. Who wants to jump in?
What can be done to?
Mega landlords.
To ensure that mega
What can be done
landlords aren't able to game the system and take money that is,
For mom and pop.
yeah, is designated for mom and pop operations.
I can take a stab at that, although it might not be the most satisfying answer, because that's not really, as far as I know, there isn't really any kind of small landlord, and it kind of surprises me considering how much, some of the bigger real estate players in Sacramento like to co-opt small landlords as part of their rhetoric when opposing tenant protections, but there isn't really any kind of prioritization scheme, as far as I know, in the rent relief program. So, which is part of the reason we've been like, small landlords, like, especially if you have a mortgage to pay, like, get at that money, like, as soon as you can, because there is no prioritization of smaller landlords over corporate landlords in terms of the relief applications. And that's partly because the relief money is tied to the eligibility of the tenant, but that's part of it. But what we have seen, I mean, the short answer is organizing. And there is something, we have seen, we have a campaign, for example, in San Francisco, one of Tenants Together's member organizations, and one of the coalition steering committee members is the Housing Rights Committee of San Francisco. And they have organized, they've been organizing since before the pandemic, tenant associations of across the properties of two of the biggest corporate landlords in San Francisco, who own, dozens, if not hundreds, of multifamily buildings in the city. And so they have, one of them is called Veritas, and the other landlord's called Mosser. ACE is currently suing Mosser in Oakland, fun fact. But yeah, I mean, what they've done is basically, like, the tenants have launched a campaign to try to keep Veritas from, accepting that money when they have $3 billion in assets in the city of San Francisco alone. So it does take, grassroots organizing can have some successes there. And, they have brought attention to the issue to the point where even Speaker Pelosi, who's our congresswoman, actually wrote a letter to Veritas asking them not to take PPP money way back when last year. But, the short answer is there's no provisions in the current program as it is set up to prioritize small landlords. So I hate to say, like, try to get the money before the big guys do, because that's not really a very satisfying answer. But really, the tool that we have is organizing, and there are folks who are organizing around that issue.
Great.
Yes,
Okay.
I'll take that.
Okay. So next question has to do with the protected classes. So Gary, you were talking about classes of people who are protected against discrimination in housing. And the question is, the hurdles that have to be overcome are sometimes insurmountable. Even if a class is protected, it's insurmountable, and they're not able to successfully challenge the landlord. Is there anything that addresses these hurdles? I mean, it seems like we have all these wonderful answers, but to actually see how it works on the ground, it's not that easy.
Right. And I assume they're talking about just the effort to try to get someone to represent them, and then get something filed, and then get some sort of relief. The whole
and
process.
get the documentation together and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, when the civil rights laws, the most current version of both the state and the federal civil rights laws, there's a little bit that is considered, because they've shifted attorney's fees, for example. So if a tenant prevails in their case, the general rule that each side pays for their attorney's fees, that doesn't apply. If a tenant wins their case, the tenant's attorney gets their attorney's fees in full from the landlord, and the landlord can only do that if he can prove that it was a frivolous case to begin with. The other thing that both state and feds have done is set up agencies such as HUD and DFEH that will take tenants' cases without the need to find an attorney. You file a complaint with those agencies, and they will assign investigators and eventually attorneys, and will prosecute that case either through the administrative process or in court. They also, through funding, they've set up fair housing councils all over at least California. That's how Michelle and I met I won't say many, I don't want to date us too much, but a while ago, we met through our fair housing council work. And those councils will also investigate fair housing cases. And they often have their own litigation departments or private attorneys that are ready to take those cases. And then finally, it's not the common practice for cities, but our city has the Public Rights Division. And I would say probably 60% of my litigation is fair housing cases that I've filed on behalf of tenants who, I don't represent the tenants, but they don't have to get an attorney. They don't have to file their own case. They filed a complaint with us. We agreed that there was a problem, and we sued the owner over that. So those are the resources that are available that I can think of off the top of my head. I definitely don't mean to, I'm definitely not diminishing the struggle that there is to get any one of those things going. It is a lot of paperwork, but there are some resources that are available for tenants.
And during the process of going through this whole, is there sort of some kind of like injunctive relief or something that would stop the landlord from evicting the tenant?
Yes, that's another thing that's built into all fair housing laws that I work with. Both Santa Monica's, the states, and the federal fair housing laws specifically provide for injunctive relief. So if a judge agrees with the tenants that there's a practice that is causing irreparable harm at the moment, they can stop that even before a jury or a judge looks at it further down. They don't need a trial to stop it. And then later in the case, if the tenant wins, they can get a permanent injunction. In reality, most of these cases are resolved before that, and we work out a lot of stipulations where the owners agree to injunctive relief that not only stops the practice, but forces the owner to attend some training so they can learn about stuff like reasonable accommodations and modifications and whatever the protected class was involved, that training can target.
Great, thank you, guys. It's a great answer. Someone was asking a similar question about someone with a disability, but I think that the disabilities could also be covered in the protected class. But,
oh, sure.
So thank you so much. Great answer.
So, were there any other questions that were not covered by the presentations, Sharon and Dick?
Yeah, well, I think we've basically got it. I get one is all these folks here and some of us on the other side work in this area, and we know the facts a lot. But the truth is, even if you read the big newspapers and watch regular broadcast television, it doesn't seem to have really gained traction that, as we said in the promo material, 500,000 people in Los Angeles County face catastrophe. We've already got 60,000 people living, at least 60,000 people living homeless on the streets. I mean, do you think what do you think it would take to really bring this to people's attention, if anything?
No answers?
I can try.
That's why I have to leave this country. I'm done. I'm done.
Everybody's exhausted.
And I do want to, before I start saying that, I do want to quickly add that we do not have lawyers on staff. We have a directory of legal aid organizations. We just put out a comprehensive Know Your Rights guide in English and Spanish with sample letters, explanations, like what you have to do, all the paperwork, this and that, like to demystify this whole process if you're having any issues as a tenant, at tenantstogether.org. We have that in English and Spanish. And it's like fully there. If you go to tenantstogether.org, it's the big link in the front of the page. It's right in your face. But we have that full COVID-19 guide, and we just overhauled it. And we're going to be adding more resources to it. And there's also a directory of legal aid organizations across the state and tenant unions across the state. So you can find one in your area just using that guide. So I just want to put that out there. That's on our website. We worked a lot on it because our website's kind of janky. In terms of that question, I mean, there has to be a huge narrative shift. I mean, I do think that representation really matters in this issue. And I believe that out of the 120 members of the state legislature, maybe 2 or 3 rent. I think it's like 2 or 3 rent. Assemblymember Lee, who we love, Alex Lee, down in the South Bay. I think he lives with his parents. So I'll count that in his favor. He's pretty pro renter. He's a socialist. So, but besides that, it's there are no renters in the legislature. I cannot make any sort of advocacy on that front. We are a C3, but I will say that that definitely contributes. That obviously there's a lot of real estate industry money at play. But there's also the fact that, like, I think that a lot of legislative offices, most of them are basically insulated. They're in their own bubble. And the only way to pierce their bubble is if they have a bunch of constituents making a stink. So that's the immediate thing. I don't want to like just say like there does have to be a huge narrative and political shift in Sacramento. Absolutely. But, you know, in terms of what you can do now, don't feel powerless because we haven't done that already. That's obviously the work that Tenants Together and Housing Now and all of us here, like that's the work that we're all doing in community and in coalition. But honestly, you know, the thing about the other side, the thing about the real estate industry that I would like to emulate, the one thing that they do that I would like to emulate is that, you know, they can put a call to action to a legislator, and basically that legislator's office is flooded with calls from landlords. They're inundated, right? And they can scare them like that. And I think that, you know, we have to build an infrastructure where we can do the same thing. Because as far as tenants are concerned, like we're half of California. And when it comes to us versus sort of real estate interests who are trying to shorten these protections or curb these protections, there's more of us than there are of them. So they have money, we have people, but it's how to mobilize those people. And like anybody, and that is something that anybody can do. Every time it doesn't feel big, but every time you write a letter, every time you make a phone call, better yet, every time you make 5 to 10 phone calls, like you are making a substantive difference there. So, I mean, that's like the shortest term answer, I guess, to the longest term.
So Shanti, I think this might be our final question since it is 7:24. Someone wants to know why.
I think Gary had his hand up too.
Oh, I'm sorry, Gary. Okay.
I just wanted to also say that stat report that I mentioned earlier, that was done in 2019, and it studied all the ways that evictions can eat up and destroy communities in terms of health, mental health, and blight. And so it's a pretty powerful report. It talks about how investing in right to counsel is truly an investment that can bring back returns to a community. So in terms of changing the narrative, like Shanti was talking about, and using some of those stats from right to counsel and using some of the descriptions and statistics that Francisco had, a new stat report needs to be drafted, I think, one that takes into account the pandemic and shows just how scary things can be if we don't come to the rescue in a big way for all these tenants.
Yeah, and there was a time when legal services was funded to do evictions and all the rest of that. We lost that funding and now we have to try to regain it. But even before that, they were funded to do grassroots organizing. And that is money that's gold. We need to get that money back also. There are mechanisms that if we rethink how we do the housing elements and other kinds of traditional things that we use within our civic responses to stuff, we could do this. You're right. The research is there, and it just needs to be rethought around the critical issues for tenants, not just landowners and not just developers and not just homeowners. So at any rate, I won't preach anymore.
So
I
we
think
have,
we're-
so we have someone who has presented a single question twice because they really want this answered. And the
Okay,
question is, why is ERAP a lottery? Won't some eligible people be left out? And I think this probably is best suited for Shanti.
Yeah. Why is it a lottery? I don't know. I mean, I honestly, that is one of our sort of policy questions, right? Is like, we need to know who's not, who's structurally like unable to access these funds like the most, like which communities are really being like the most underserved, because we can tell that from our experience on the ground, but we need to actually see that data, and there's really very, very little transparency. So in terms of why they made it a lottery, I honestly think the simple answer is because they thought it would be easier. But of course, like, you're seeing all these, even the people who have applied, you're not seeing really money go out right now because of all the hurdles that they've created, all the paperwork, all the red tape. I think it was a decision that was based off of ease. I don't know, Francisco, if you have any thoughts, or if anyone else has any other thoughts, but like, I don't really think that, I don't really think that they really thought that through as much as they should have. Which again, I'm not full of satisfying answers today,
Yeah.
but that is what we're trying to shift. Francisco, I thought you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I responded to the same question in the Q&A. It is a complicated setup because the state has its own program, and some cities and counties have their own programs, and there might be different requirements based on where you live and your own income. So trying to find the right program for you has been challenging. At this point, I have not heard of any jurisdiction, though, that is doing a lottery. There are some jurisdictions that have complained that the allocation formula that the state used to divide up the money was not the right one. We hear that they used general population. Every city and county got the funds based on the proportion of general population, when some larger cities that have a high proportion of low income renters feel like they're not getting their share of the funds based on that type of a formula, because you're adding homeowners into that mix, you're adding landlords into that mix, when the correct metric should have been low income renters. And so that is one of the other things we are asking for changes in this next round of funding, or any changes that are made to the state's program. But there might be some programs that are doing lotteries. I have not heard of that. The bureaucratic hurdles in and of themselves are making it hard to be already. Just filling, like Shanti said, 3 hours to fill out an application, and you can't save the application. So if you're not able to finish it within those 3 hours, you have to start all over again. So again, these are some of the challenges that folks are facing, and we do need to make it easier for everybody.
well, I want to thank all of our panelists tonight, and to keep faith with our promise to end on time, I'm going to turn it back over to John and let him close out the evening. Thank you all.
This is where we virtually clap and do all the things, and such a great panel. Thank you so much to everyone and all the attendees who stuck on, and I couldn't agree with you more. And especially as a local elected official, I completely agree with everything that people were saying, and all that we can do to help renters, especially during this time. Before you go, there wouldn't be a good ACLU event if there wasn't a call to action. So the number one way in which you can get involved is to ensure that you are members of the ACLU of Southern California. This is the first way to get involved with local chapters, looking at you, Michelle, Dick, and Sharon, and everyone else, but also the ways in which you can get involved in all the advocacy that we're doing at the statewide level on housing justice, on economic justice. The ACLU of Southern California is really one of the only affiliates in the entire country that focuses on economic justice. And that's really important, especially for the conversations we're having today. So I think that link was dropped in the chat. If not, it will be very shortly. But please go and join. Become a member. I carry my card around with me everywhere I go. And it's so important that you do too, because this is just one of the many programs that we do amongst all the stuff staff does on advocacy and activism for you to get engaged with. And I'll turn it back over to you, Michelle.
Okay, with that, we are out of here. I see Malik telling us we're gone. So good night, farewell, be safe.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Email tomorrow.